Okay, class, so here's our second and final video for our Unit 4, talking about Nazim Hikmet. Um, like I mentioned, we had a much smaller kind of collection of poems that I asked you to look at for this. There are a couple of them that I plucked out for being interesting, right? The Occupation as kind of a quintessential political poem, which I think is interesting for us to have read in context of many of the poets we have read and will read in this, being poets who survived revolution and war, even going back to Du Fu, right, in the early parts of the century, right, of the millennia, actually. Cucumber, just as a strong poem, right? I liked it kind of as a palate cleanser before we get into something a lot broader, and kind of a more traditional but strong poem. Things that I want you to kind of keep with that are some fun, just freaking kick-ass images and the use of repetition, right? If you go back and look at that poem, which I encourage you to do for your response, look at that and think about what repetition does in that poem, right? Hikmet, to me, as a poet, looking at other poets writing poetry and trying to see what I can learn from them, Hikmet does a lot to teach me about the power of repetition as a tool to change a lot of facets of a poem, whether we're talking about general pressure, speed, tone, mood. There's so many levels of the poem that I think change through repetition, right? Choosing what language you repeat, what does it mean, how do we massage the meaning into different shapes, right? Coming back to something in different contexts, right? Constantly keeping repetition interesting, right? Hikmet is pretty top tier at doing that, right? So in that, right, I wanted to spend this video taking a deeper look at Straw-Blond, okay? Really long poem, right? That's why I didn't give you guys that many selections. I wanted us to have kind of a small sampler plate and then kind of a big meaty poem to specifically engage with from this selection that I think is really indicative of some of the heights of what Hikmet can do and the low points, right? And then at the end I want to kind of talk about the interest of this in particular with its relationship to translation, okay? So Straw-Blond, right? Hikmet, as we talked about in the previous video, was often described as a romantic, revolutionary romantic communist, right? Which makes me consider how much of this, I think, comes from romanticism in literature, kind of a mid-19th century thing all about individualism and emotion, and the heightening of what had come before and of nature, right? Moving out of kind of this vaunted intellectual space of the classics and that the Victorians were as stoked about, and moving kind of to a love of the more simpler and the more human, right? This puts us in an interesting lens to look at Hikmet's work through, right? I think some of the romanticism that comes through in his work isn't necessarily romantic in the literary sense, right? It is in the broadest spectrum of, it feels like the poems care about emotion and they care about people, right? And kind of an overarching desire on Hikmet's part to press forward for people to have and be able to experience kind of freedom of expression and engagement on an emotional level. What I think becomes particularly interesting is how much it kind of is like romanticized in the idea of just kind of being the most vaunted and prettiest version of ideas, and the ideals behind revolution, behind communism, right? That Hikmet puts through in his poem, right? And I would pose as a question to keep in mind, right? Do both parts of Straw-Blond, right, deal with different kinds of romanticism, right? I could see an argument for saying that parts of the first are literarily romantic, right? and we'll talk about that as we go. The second part, I think, it's difficult to say if it is actually romantic on its ideals or if it is if it falls flat on them, right? If it tries to hide something in romanticism, I think, which I don't think the first part does. The first part feels more honest, right? So let's kind of flip through this. We'll read through not the whole thing because it's, again, like 10 pages, but we're going to clip through a couple sections of it that I want to particularly highlight. We're going to talk about potent techniques that show up in these sections and what they kind of do for us and do for the poem. And then we'll have, again, a context of how this could have been particularly difficult to translate, I think, right? So, Straw-Blond, it has a dedication to Vera Tulkiavoka, with my deep respect. We'll get around to that, right? But whenever you see kind of like a to thing, it's a dedication. Anytime you see in a piece of work, if it has kind of that italicized like a quote or something underneath it, it's called an epigraph. Whereas an epitaph is the thing you put on a tombstone. An epigraph is that kind of like undertitle quote or line or something of the sort, right? So it is distinctly by Hikmet divided up into two parts, okay? 1, at dawn the express entered the station unannounced. It was covered with snow. I stood on the platform, my coat collar raised. The platform was empty. A sleeper window stopped in front of me. Its curtains were parted. A young woman slept in the lower berth in the twilight. Her hair straw-blonde, eyelashes blue. Her full red lips looked spoiled and pouting. I didn't see who was sleeping in the upper berth. Unannounced, the express slipped out of the station. I don't know where it came from or to where it was going. I watched it leave. I was sleeping in the upper berth in the Bristol Hotel in Warsaw. I hadn't slept so soundly in years, and yet my bed was wooden and narrow, and a young woman slept in another bed, her hair straw-blonde, eyelashes blue, her white neck long and smooth. She hadn't slept so soundly in years, and yet her bed was wooden and narrow. Time sped on, and we were nearing midnight. We hadn't slept so soundly in years, and yet our beds were wooden and narrow. I'm coming down the stairs from the 4th floor. The elevator is out again. Inside mirrors, I'm coming down the stairs. I could be 20, I could be 100. Time sped on. I was nearing midnight. On the 3rd floor, a woman is laughing behind a door. A sad rose slowly opened in my right hand. I met a Cuban ballerina at the snowy windows on the 2nd floor. She flashed past my forehead like a fresh dark flame. The poet Nicolas Guillen went back to Havana long ago. For years we sat in the hotel lobbies of Europe and Asia, drinking the loss of our cities drop by drop. 2 things are forgotten only with death: the face of our mothers and the face of our cities. Wood barges swim into the wind early mornings in winter, like old rowboats that have cut themselves loose. And in the ashes of a brazier, my big Istanbul wakes up from sleep. 2 things are forgotten only with death. The doorman saw me off, his cloak sinking into the night. I walked into the icy wind and neon. Time sped on. I was nearing midnight. They came upon me suddenly. It was light as day, but no one else saw. A squad of them. They had jackboots, pants, coats, arms, swastikas on their arms, hands, automatics in their hands. They had shoulders, helmets on their shoulders, but no heads. Between their shoulders and their helmets, nothing. They even had collars and necks, but no heads. They were soldiers whose deaths are not mourned. I walked on. You could see the fear. You could see their fear, animal fear. I can't say it showed in their eyes. They didn't have heads to have eyes. You could see their fear, animal fear. It showed in their boots. Can boots show fear? Theirs did. In their fear, they opened fire. They fired nonstop at all the buildings, all vehicles, all living things. Every sound, the least movement. They even fired at a poster of blue fish on Chopin Street, but not so much as a piece of plaster fell or a window broke. And no one but me heard the shots. The dead, even an SS squad, the dead can't kill. The dead kill by coming back as worms inside the apple. But you could see their fear, animal fear. Wasn't this city killed before they were? Weren't the bones of the city broken one by one and its skin flayed? Weren't book covers made from the skin? From its skin, soap from its oil, rope from its hair. But it was standing before them, like a hot loaf of bread in the icy night wind. Time sped on, and I was nearing midnight. Right? And it keeps going on, right? So let's talk some structural things, and then we'll get into some broader contexts, okay? So for part one, right, one thing you should hopefully have noticed very quickly is it has what we would call refrains in music, right? We come back to things, right? Time sped on, I was nearing midnight, right? We have the first bit with the who's sleeping in the top berth. The woman, her hair straw-blonde, eyelashes blue, and then she changes, right? These aspects of repetition do a lot when of what I would probably describe as grounding, right? Let's kind of contextualize probably two of the most visual ones, right? Both of the women with straw-blonde in the first two pages, right? Straw-blonde hair, blue eyes, red pouty lips, right? Straw-blonde hair, blue eyelashes, long pale neck, right? He is showing us different things, ostensibly, right? We're moving through time. He even kind of comments on the timelessness of that with I could be 20, I could be 100, right? Like he is unmoored in the sense of where he is in his life. He's just awash in memory, right? And as you're probably familiar with plenty of media that deals with dreams, with fiction of the mind or a stream of consciousness, which is very much feels like or plays at being like, right? It does not necessarily follow logically. We move, right? There's association and very free association, right? I'd argue this poem is structured in a way to make you think it's stream of consciousness and how it's phrased, but there's a distinct structuring to how often things are repeated and what is chosen to be repeated, right? Look at the Straw-Blond, right? The titular phrase, right? We come back to two physical aspects that can be the same, right? Easy things to imagine. You know, strawberry blonde hair, blue eyes. I'm in, right? Red lips, cool. We've moved on to this woman, and we're talking about the train, right? Come back. We can imagine blonde hair, blue eyes, and then she has a long, pale neck, and we're on to another woman, right? By giving us points of familiarity that are sensory details, right? Easily visualized things, right? To create a very fast kind of mental facsimile of what the subject might be of a particular thing. It does a lot for us, right? Then we get to more kind of abstract refrains, right? As time sped on and I was nearing midnight, right? You know, there's so much to that phrase that's kind of interesting on a analytical level, right? So, for example, time sped on, that lead-in, I think, is just playing to an overarching feel of the poem that these are all fleeting moments, right? Things are just going to keep moving. Time is running away. Just like the poem has that speed, right? As you read through it, it kind of just wants to roll. It goes, it goes, it goes. And the repetition does a lot of that. It's a drum beat underneath the song of this poem. It pushes us forward, right? Time sped on, time sped on, time sped on, right? It's almost dismissive, right? Like, all this happened and time kept going, right? Like, time keeps going. It's the train is leaving the station, right? And I was nearing midnight, right? As an interesting thing, right? It wasn't it was nearing midnight. It's that I was nearing midnight, right? An interesting choice of words, right? So midnight can have all sorts of connotations, right? It can be the end, right? It's the end of the day, right? The very end at midnight. The day is done. It moves on to the next one, right? Is it the end of life? Is it a moment of change, right? Either way, right? Much like noon, right, in the Western, right, or the witching hour, or all sorts of times that we give a particular name to, right? Rush hour, right? Like it has connotations that come with it, right? Midnight is weighty and dark and quiet and lonely and final, right? And for someone to be approaching their midnight, right? I am approaching midnight. Interesting, right? Like, what is the midnight of a person? What's the midnight of their life, right? What does that mean, right? And I think the poem gives you a lot of space to kind of ruminate on that, in the sense that we come back to it a lot. However, I don't necessarily always think it necessarily gives you a distinct answer, because, as the first part of that line says, the poem's going to keep going, right? So I want you to pay particular attention to that repetition, the refrain, right? We're coming back, we're weaving across places in time. Hikmet tells us it doesn't matter where we are in time, it just matters that these are the moments and they wash away and how quickly time is going, right? And you want to look at them, and that how there's only two things that death really can get rid of, right? There's only two real things that really get forgotten, right? And it's the that line with the faces of our mothers and the faces of our cities, right? An interesting connection, right? The city as mother. It comes from before it's died already, right? Already playing into these kind of big things. The city is the mother. It's the place of nurturing, right? Like, and you're stuck in this understanding of being something from that, right? From the mother, from the city, gives you a unique perspective that no one else has, that dies with you, right? And it's interesting to see him kind of contextualize on that, right? In the context of the rest of the poem, saying all these things happen and time just keeps going, right? But those are the only two that really die with death, right? There's an open-endedness that just say that those two only are forgotten in death. Does that mean the others are just forgotten, right? Or that the forgetting of them is less important somehow, or less momentous, or maybe they aren't forgotten, right? Different ways to read it, right? I kind of take it as that they kind of wash away much more inconsequentially, right? Whereas those things, that kind of relation to where you came from, and that thought of what its face looked like, what it looks like to you, right, goes with you at your midnight, is really, really beautiful and haunting, right? Fascinating, right? In terms of romanticism, right? Romantic in the looking at the person and the longing and the big, grand sense of time as a natural force. Very romantic, right? Romantic in a revolutionary political sense, for sure, right? Like, look at what's been done to us. You don't spend a page talking about the horrors of what the SS and the Nazis did to places, and the forgetting of them, and the rebuilding of places after they've been taken by the ultimate evil of the fascist, the hyper conservative angle of Nazism, right? That you just can't not have that be inherently an idealistic discussion, right? And it's definitely romantic, right? There is no more acceptable villain than the Nazi, right? Nobody with any common sense looks at a Nazi and goes maybe this isn't just a universally acceptable thing to hate, right? Yeah, Nazis bad, right? The most idealistic and basic and romanticized villain to be able to put against the clearest villain, right? So it seems very romantic in that sense too, right? And this section goes on for a while. This is, to me, this weaving, this constantly coming back to a interesting series of constantly evolving refrains, right? We get new refrains as we go, and some of them come back around again, right? He doesn't let them get old on us, which is really, really technically impressive. And it's one of the best long poems ever written, right? Then we get into the other complication of like, holy shit, this is translated, right? And there's some structural things that immediately become apparent to me when I think about it in translation. There's no punctuation. The lines kind of just roll into each other, right? There aren't a lot of capitalizations if it's not an I, right, or a name. No proper noun. The proper nouns and most of the other ones just don't. It is just a roll, right? It keeps going, right? And I think that structurally makes plenty of sense, right? He blows apart what are very oftentimes very kind of tight, very lyrically constructed forms that would be more traditional into this kind of big sprawl, right? However, I think, as I said, there is a trick to making it seem more chaotic than it is. Like, this feels purposefully constructed in this way, okay? It goes on all the way to page 251, right? And at the end we get this litany, right? This like bam, 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 repeated structures, right? And they're all the I's, right? Where he's been looking at this younger version of himself, right? And then just the world is the taste of a green apple in his mouth, the feel of a 14-year-old girl's breasts in his hands, right? Songs go for miles and miles in his eyes, death measures a handspan. He has no idea what all will happen to him. Only I know what will happen, because everything I believed, he believes. I loved all the women he'll love. I wrote all the poems he'll write. I stayed in all the prisons he'll stay in. I passed through all the cities he will visit. I suffered all his illnesses. I slept all his nights, dreamed all his dreams. I lost all that he will lose. Her hair straw-blonde, her eyelashes blue. Her black coat has a white collar and big pearl buttons. I didn't see, right? So we end on this like such a romantic imagery, right? Like it's so much about the individual, right? And like the immensity of time and existence and memoir, right? Really, really, really strong ending, right? Obviously the weirdness of like it's 14-year-old girl's breasts. Like, is he talking about like specifically being young and stuff? Well, weird and old timey and strange, right? But the other stuff, rock solid, right? And then we hit part 2, right? And knowing he spent as much time in Russia, you're like, right, we're going to talk about this part where he goes to the east, right? However, right, the kind of big wrinkle I hit when I hit this part of the poem, right, is did the poem need to continue after I didn't see, right? Keep in mind, right, yes, it's split into 2 sections, right? I've done multi-part poems. Sometimes there's small individual things that all go together. So his argument in creating this structure is these 2 poems must exist together, right? They are part of a whole, okay? So then we get the issue of part 2, right? My 19th year crosses Bayezid Square, comes out on Red Square, and goes down Concord. I meet Abedin and we talk squares, and the day before yesterday, Gagarin circled the biggest square of all and returned. Titov, too, will come back around, will go around and come back 17 and a half times, but I don't know about it yet. I talk spaces and shapes with Abedin and in my attic hotel room, and the Seine flows on both sides of Notre Dame. From my window at night, I see the Seine as a sliver of moonlight on the wharf of the stars, and a young woman sleeps in my attic room, mixed with the chimneys of the Paris roofs. She hasn't slept so soundly in years, her straw-blonde hair curled, her blue eyelashes like clouds on her face. With Abedin, I discuss the space and shape of the atom seed. We speak of Rumi whirling in space. Abedin plants the colors of unlimited speed. I eat up the colors like fruit. And Matisse is a fruit peddler. He sells the fruits of the cosmos, like our Abedin and Avni and Levni, and spaces, shapes, and colors seen by microscopes and rocket portholes, and they're poets, painters, and musicians, and so on and so on. What I want you to keep in mind reading through this, right, is let's contextualize this compared to part one, right, and try and unpack a little bit of why this second part is so frustrating to a number of people, right? We had that first question I gave you, right? It's like, does the poem need to continue after the first part, right? Hikmet seems to have believed it did, right? So that it's moving on, right? Does it bring up some threads from before? Yeah, we get the Straw-Blond, right? As a connection back, right? And we start to have sort of similar moves in repetition, right? We come back to similar people. There's anchors, right? But notice the refrain there is not as it's not as sensory as what we had before, right? So the Straw-Blond, those aspects of it, the constant recurrence of gold, right? Things like that. There's a man. Now we're in names, right? So while the name's been no name for the Straw-Blond, right? Why is like the woman was so central. The women are all so central to these scenes, but they're not named in much the same way before. We have the dedication, who we could imply maybe that's the Straw-Blond, right? But it's not. The refrain lacks the sensory detail, right? And then we have this weird comparison of names, right? Bringing up all these names, right? And then, hey, these are all communist and Soviet people of note, right? Like, and then we're talking about the space race and the atom and the microscopic and all these scientific wonderments that we have done, that the Soviets have done, right? And it's what I think is most striking and kind of highlights this as like this feels immediately disingenuous is go back to that thought early on in the first part. The only things forgotten with death are your mother's face and the city's face, right? We had a big, broad romantic idea, right? And now we're kind of listing achievements of the Soviets in the Great Square, and we're name dropping Soviet things because they're Soviet, right? And not remember, this is not just like communist ideals. These aren't ideals, right? This is the regime, the place, right? It's not just talking about and the workers and the this and that. Yeah, it's this person did this person did this. Look at the atom. Look at the great understanding of the cosmos we've gotten to have, right? And then we're going to get to Gagarin and Cuba, right? And Gagarin popped up before, right? But Gagarin left, right? That was the point. Gagarin was gone, right? So now we've gone back to this point in time, and we sit in it a lot longer than we're allowed to sit in moments in the other poem, in the other half, right? Everything about how this structured feels compositionally, like idealism aside, right? Compositionally does not match, right? So we've gone through all this big royal, and it doesn't do a couple things. One, it doesn't necessarily elucidate on anything from the previous section, right? It presents itself as if it will, okay? But it does not, right? So it does this deep dive into a particular period, which we get hints of with Gagarin showing up in Paris, right? But does it like, it feels much more narrow than the first part. Now, if this was many, many parts, and we kept going into deep dives of these moments that we've brushed past as time rushes forward, right? I would find that fascinating, right? Like as a number of other sections, right? However, it doesn't do that, right? It just kind of does this small microcosm, scatters a great number of names throughout, which is not something the first section really does, right? So why are the names there, right? Well, if we try and take out what the likely reason is, right, which is that you want a check for writing a very Soviet poem, right? We get to this weird kind of context of why aren't there as many names in the last section? What does this elucidate for us? I don't necessarily think it does any particular elucidating, right? Where's the focus on the mother's face and the city's face again? Like it's Paris kind of and Moscow kind of, right? Like, and we're moving through these squares, right? But we don't spend as much time with them, right? And we don't kind of elucidate on the same or ruminate on these big ideas that are otherwise brought up earlier on, and it's a tremendous shame, right? By comparison, then we also get the other thing of like it's, let's see, so it's 251, 243. So we've got around 8 pages, and then we've got like 4 for the others, right? So it's not nearly as long or complex, right? It's a rush by comparison, right? We have this whole long part about Cuba and Fidel and what he's doing, and it enters, and pardon the pun of it being related to communism anyway, but it enters manifesto territory in the most literal sense, right? Where it's, I am espousing thoughts at you. This is what I believe, right? But it does it in a way that starts to lack poetic finesse that we saw so perfectly laid out in the first section, right? First section has all these interesting techniques, and then it's all names and specifics and things like that, and like, why this? In a sense that like reading the second section along with the first is diminishing to the first part, because by being specific, it implies that the thing that you're supposed to take overall from all of this is the specific, right? The broader poem, the broader part of part 1 is the setup to this crystallization, which sucks, right? Like the first part of the poem is just a better poem, right? If it ends with I didn't see, goddamn flawless victory, perfect long poem, right? Goes into part 2, and it's just, oh, here we go, right? This is the somebody needs a check section of this, and it sucks, right? So it's interesting to consider when you guys are looking at it. I want you guys to pay particular attention to the technique differences between both parts. What shows up more in one than the other? Why, right? And kind of really reflect on that, okay? Translation-wise, right? A very long poem with not a lot of punctuation to kind of break up the syntax. That's just goddamn going, and it's constantly look at the Straw-Blond sections again where that specific refrain shows up. It's similar but slightly different, right? Big thing to tackle for a translator, right? And then we hit the second part of this where it becomes, even the language, I would argue in this one, feels a little bit drier in the second section, and it makes me wonder, like, did the translator get to part 2? And we're just like, okay. yeah. The Soviet thing. This is part of the poem, I have to put it here, right? But it doesn't feel as nuanced, right? And then it runs into an interesting note of criticism here, right? Is that comparative flatness a translation issue or a writing issue? It's not something we can immediately be able to weigh without access to the translator and access to an understanding of the native language, right? However, it feels much more, given the quality of translations through this, right? A great number of these poems are beautifully translated, right? With an eye to the poetic, right? I think that it's particularly interesting to see, like, why did these fall flat, right? Why do they become just kind of these checkmark things? Is it more or less of his concern with being a fanatic for, like, the system, right? Rather than an idealist for the cause? If it becomes mechanical, straightforward, and part of that system, in a sense, in the second part, versus it maybe being a sign of just going through the motions, right? How does reading it either way kind of affect how we feel about it, right? just a lot of ways we can engage with it in fascinating senses. Take the time, I would say, to read the foreword, right, and the translator's preface, right. He spends a lot of time. Both of these give us a little bit of context about how the people working on this project felt about it. Okay. I might sound particularly harsh, right, on the come out of this, where it's just like, what is this trash? Second part of the poem, right? But what I want you to understand is I'm so annoyed by it because of how much I love what it was trying to do, right? Like, we come so close, right? And I have cited in professional work the first part of Straw-Blond like a bajillion times, to the point where it's almost a meme in classes that I'm in. It's like, well, if you're going to do repetition, we got to do it this way, like at least as good as this guy, right? But as far as my kind of academic interest in the work goes, the second part may as well, for me, not exist, right? It doesn't do anything to me that I find particularly engaging, right? I'm interested to see how you guys engage with it, if you find it particularly interesting. Kind of, again, the thing that I tend to find students struggle with a little bit in differentiating it nowadays, perhaps as a sign of things getting a little bit broader in spectrum, right? And as someone who often, tends to quite strongly identify myself with more leftist ideals, right? The differentiation between being a communist, right, and being a proponent of the Soviet Union, like being a Soviet, and then being a Stalinist, right? Like, kind of the different spectrums of what those mean and the implication of problem that comes with which, right? I understand it can be difficult just because being pro-communist is not nearly as much of a, or being pro-socialist or anything of that sort is much less of a immediate kind of smackdown in modern existence in the West. Right? That being said, right, you will see plenty of things where what they're really talking about, to some extent, is an issue of it being Soviet or being Stalinist, in a discussion of someone being communist, right? But also understanding that, like, the West and Turkey, even at the time for Hikmet, were super not about just even the baseline ideals of communists. Like, this is a problem. It's actively considered a threat and needs to be eradicated, right? And those that interact with it need to be shunned and gotten rid of, right? So just keep that little asterisk in mind, right? When they're talking about problems with the person being a communist, right? When you see like a 1997 New York Times op-ed response where they're like, well, the problem is that with you mischaracterizing Hikmet's communist ideals is that although he did praise Stalin, he also said you shouldn't be a fanatic for the system. And it's like, well, like, he's an idealist, but he's also specifically praising Stalin. So what's the problem there? It's not necessarily the communist ideals, right? It's the fact that he's praising Stalin, right? Like, there's just a good gaggle of people in history that you don't really give credit. Like, this person had some good ideas, right? Like, not winning any friends doing that, not making a good point, right? And Stalin's definitely on that list, right? So thank you guys so much for this unit. Again, for the next one, pick up the Dulce Maria Loina's book, right? I'm trying to see if I have it on my shelf over here. Just a second. I should, I believe. I have it handy. And if I don't, you should be able to find it easily online. No, I don't have it handy. Yes, so please pick up Dulce Maria Loina's book as listed on the syllabus, right? One other thing I want you to pick up in the meantime, right, besides Absolute Solitude, go ahead and get Aristotle's The Poetics. There's going to be some specific questions about it going into the next unit as well. We're not going to read this in as much of a translation. It's going to kind of straddle the next couple units. Okay. Also, keep an eye out on the larger assignment that's going live later today. Okay, which today is the 20th, and you'll have a number of weeks over the top of the other unit. We're going to be starting to work on it. Okay, so with that being said, we'll do Loinaz and start Aristotle for the next unit, and then we'll coast into Thanksgiving, heading into kind of the rest of our things. So we still have Rilke and Apollinaire, who are both European. Apollinaire having particular ties to Picasso and therefore like in through Hikmet and all that same space, and Rilke in other interesting ways, right? We'll go very very European with both, and then we'll finish up with what I think will be the most interesting one to talk about as kind of a broader spectrum on translation, which is the Kojiki, which we go straight back into the mythological, right? And the poetics will come back into discussion for those as well. I haven't decided the exact order of those last three, but they're going to kind of go in short order through the end of the semester, along with one last big assignment, which will be a translation of your own that you guys are going to do. Okay, so with that being said, I will see you all for the next unit. Thank you.